Hello everyone. Today we are going to start the second part of the spinal cord. This lecture has been coming along for a long time, and some of you may be waiting for this lecture. So without further ado, we're going to continue with this lecture. In this discussion, we are going to look at the second part of the spinal cord, and this is going to be the internal structure that will include the spinal tracts, and then I'm also going to discuss some of the spinal cord pathways as well. So what are the major functions of the spinal tract? So the first major function of the spinal cord include the conduction of the nerve impulses, and then we have the reflex modulations. The conduction of the nerve impulses, there are two type of tracts that you need to familiarize yourself with. First of all is the afferent, and the second one is the efferent. You have listened to this term afferent and efferent in uh, different discussions in a different lectures. So afferent, so afferent basically starting with A. These type of tracts are sensory in nature, and they will carry the signals from the periphery to the brain. The second one is the efferent, which is of course motor in nature, and they will carry the signals from the brain, so it is visceral, to the periphery. So one goes towards the central nervous system, other comes out of the central nervous system. One is sensory in nature, the other one is motor in nature. So a few things to remember when we are going to discuss it further. First term that you need to familiarize yourself is the decussation. The decussation term is going to be discussed, or you're going to hear this term again and again, coming down in the different discussion, different pathways that we're going to discuss later. So it is referred to as the neurons which are crossing over the midline, of course within the spinal cord or the brainstem. For example, the right is going to go towards the left and the left is going to go towards the right, or vice versa. So the naming system, that is another thing that you need to remember. So the naming system is very easy. It starts with where the nerves are originating and where they are terminating. So a good example would be a cortico-spinal tract. So of course divided into cortico, and the second one as the spinal one. So basically it is originating from the cortex and it is terminating into the spinal cord. That's how you can remember the names of the tracts. Before we go any further, let's look at the different divisions of the gray matter, also called as the rexed lamina. So the gray matter in the spinal cord is divided into 10 parts. Each part has their own functions, hence it is called rexed lamina. Just for your understanding what the rexed lamina is, so now we're going to look at each of the following in separation. So you look at this, we have lamina 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have 6, 7, number 8 is right here, number 9 and number 10. So more lateral in the spinal cord is number 1, and more medial is going to be number 10. Of course, there is a central canal, so there is nothing, no other gray matter present there. So number 1 to number 4 is basically sensory in nature, and it is transmitting the extraceptive sensation up the spinal cord. So remember, sensory goes up, motor comes down. So like the fine touch, temperature and pressure, these are the major functions that are being, or major signals that are being transmitted from rex lamina number 1 to 4, and they are present in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So you look at in this picture, lamina 1, lamina 2, 3 and 4, that is involved in extraceptive sensations, signals going up the spinal cord towards the brain that include the fine touch, temperature and pressure. Now we're going to proceed further. The next one is number 5 and number 6. They are responsible for the proprioceptive sensation, and they will relay the information between the midbrain and the cerebellum. So we're looking at number 5 and number 6 right here. Number 6 has its own functions as well. So number 6 will give rise to the neurons that will again give rise to the spinocerebellar pathway, which are ascending in nature. Again, the name, remember this, spinocerebellar, originating in spinal cord, going into the cerebellum. That's what it is. Now let's look at number 7. Number 7 has a visceral motor output, which comprise of the sympathetic motor output. So basically 1 to 6 is sensory in nature, 7 onwards up to 10 is basically motor in nature, or number 9, number 10 is basically where the decussation axon take place. So number 8 and number 9, these are the final motor output neurons which supply the periphery, and number 10, that's where the decussation of the axons take place. So once again, decussation, so this is number 10. Some nerve coming down, it will cross the midline, go down. If there is a nerve coming up, it will go down, like they go up, and then it will go like this, and provide the signals or the transmission of signals to the brain or from the brain. That's where the decussation take place. So we're going to look in detail of one of the Rex lamina, number 9. It is important, and it's also a high yield topic, so you should remember this lamina in detail. So this one has a final motor output neuron and its functions. So hence it has two type of neurons in itself. One is alpha and the other one is gamma neurons. And these neurons can be divided into proximal and distal, or flexor and extensor rule. So basically, the Rex lamina can be divided into two type of rules, or the neurons can be divided where they're supplying from the motor perspective, either the motor or distal one or the flexor or extensor one. Let's look at the proximal and distal one. More proximal muscle neurons are present medially, and while the distal musculature neurons are present more laterally. So if you look at this, proximal and distal, more proximal the muscles are, more neurons are present in the medial part of the spinal cord. More distal the muscles are, it's going to be more lateral in the spinal cord, or the flexor extensor rule. So these neurons for the extensor muscles are present more posteriorly, which means more lateral. Here, I'm sorry, this is the anterior and this is the posterior. So let's do this. So more posteriorly is basically present the extensor muscles, and more anteriorly, or more towards the midline, or anteriorly right here, more neurons that are providing the flexors that are present here. So you can remember it through this. Now we're going to look at the different pathway which we have been discussing from before. So spinal cord is going to be divided into different brain tracts, or the spinal cord tracts, and they can be divided into two major groups, one or two or three major groups. So number one is the ascending tract, number two is the descending tract, another one is the autonomic tract, but the portion of the autonomic tracts is minor as compared to the ascending and descending. So the ascending tracts can carry the sensory information up the cord towards the brain, and it consists of three type of neurons. Number one is the first order neuron, second order neuron, and then we have the third order neuron. So first order neuron will detect the stimulus and it will transmit to the spinal cord. So its job, for example, if there is a limb, its job is to transmit the signal to the spinal cord. That's where the spinal cord is. The second order neuron will carry the signal up from the spinal cord to the brainstem. And from the brainstem, that's where the second order neuron is. From up the brainstem, the third order neuron will take it to the cerebral cortex. That's a third order neuron. That's what it will do. The descending tract, on the other hand, has only two type of neurons. One is the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So let's look at them. Upper motor neuron is going to be present in the soma of the brain, synapses with the lower motor neuron. And the lower motor neuron will carry the motor signal to the muscles or the target organ. So for example, if this is the brain right here, upper motor neuron is going to extend from out here. It will synapse here with the second motor neuron, either up here or right before exiting the spinal cord. And the second motor order neuron is going to go to the muscle or target organ. So for example, lower limb or any other target organ, let's say liver. So that's where the second lower motor neuron is going to go. The third one is basically the autonomic fibers. So that consists of both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. So they're mostly located in the lateral aspect of the spinal cord and do not exist in the well-defined tract. So it's all over the place. And it will synapse with the cell bodies in the intermediolateral columns of the gray matter. I have discussed that in my previous lectures of the autonomic nervous system, and that will also include the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. I have discussed that in detail over there. So just a little bit of a review. The sympathetic fiber exit from T1 to L2, and the parasympathetic fiber exit the nerves from S2 to S4. Now this is the high yield slide. Please pay attention to this. So the another one that we're going to look at is the dorsal column or medial lemniscal or DCML system for the spinal cord tracts. So it is basically an ascending sensory tract in the posterior portion of the spinal cord, and it has no decussation. So that's an important point that you have to remember. So the major functions carried out will include the transmission of the sensory signals for pressure, vibration, fine touch, and proprioception. So that is basically controlling the conscious part of it. Then we have the dorsal column that is divided into fasciculus, gracilis, which will have the synapses or the neurons from the lower limb, and the fasciculus cuneatus that will have the neurons from the upper limb. The fibers will end in the ipsilateral. Ipsilateral means same side. So remember this part. You're going to hear contralateral and ipsilateral. Ipsilateral same time, contralateral the other side. So the fibers will end in the ipsilateral medulla that will then find its way up to thalamus and then the somatosensory cortex. Again, it will have 3 order neurons. So the first order neuron, it is sensory nerve ending of the pseudo-unipolar neuron in the dorsal root ganglion. It will then enter into the spinal cord and ascend again ipsilaterally in the dorsal column of the spinal cord. The first synapse will occur at either the nucleus gracilis if the nerve is coming from the lower limb, or the nucleus cuneatus if it is coming from the upper limb, lower limb, upper limb. Again, it will ascend in the ipsilateral medulla. Second order neuron, it will decussate in the medulla. Decussation, remember? Neuron coming in, crossing the midline, going up. That's decussation portion right there. So it will decussate in the medulla and then it will ascend contralaterally in the medial lemniscus. Then we have a second synapse that it will occur in the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. And then the third order neuron, it will then project the somatosensory cortex. That's the final neuron. It will terminate there. So let's look at that. This is the lower limb, and then we have upper limb. So nucleus gracilis is for the lower limb, and nucleus cuneatus is for the upper limb. So any neuron coming to the nucleus cuneatus is going to synapse there, or the lower limb over here, nucleus gracilis. Sorry, the lower limb neurons are ascending up there. So that's where the first synapse occur. This is the first order neuron. These ones are the second order neuron, and then we have the another synapse occurring there, and this is the third order neuron that's happening over there. So first synapse right here and second synapse over there, first order, second order, third order neuron. So you see it's ascending in the same side of the spinal cord, decussate, go up ipsilaterally, another synapse going to the third one. So pretty simple to remember. Now we're going to look at another major ascending tract, and it is also a high yield one, spinothalamic tract. Again, spinal cord, thalamus, spinothalamic tract. It is also known as the anterior lateral tract because it follows the path in the anterior lateral portion of the spinal cord. What are the functions? The main functions will include the transmission of the signals for pain, temperature, gross and crude touch, pressure, itch, and tickle. The anterior part of this tract is responsible for transmitting the crude touch, and the lateral part of this tract are responsible for the transmission of the pain and temperature. Again, we're going to look at the order neurons. So the first order neurons, so these neurons, again, they are pseudo-unipolar neurons, will enter the spinal cord from the posterior aspect called the Lissauer's tract and will ascend or descend depending on the location, and then synapse in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Second order neuron, it will decussate in the spinal cord. Decussation will occur in the spinal cord as the anterior white commissure and will ascend contralaterally. Coming up, decussation, contralateral ascension. Then we have a second synapse. The second synapse will occur in the ventral posterior lateral portion of the thalamus, and the third order neuron will then continue superiorly to the contralateral somatosensory cortex. Again, entering from here in the Lasauer's tract, decussate at the same level, and then enter going up, second synapse right here, and that's where the third order neuron. So this is the first order neuron right here. This is the second order neuron, and this one is the third order neuron. Pretty easy to remember. Now we're going to look at another major ascending tract, and this one is the spinal cerebellar tract. Again, simple to remember, spinal cord and cerebellum are involved. So it is the ascending sensory tract in the lateral portion of the cord, and this tract has the dorsal and ventral components. But when it comes to the decussation, dorsal fiber does not decussate, while the ventral fiber decussate upon entering the cord. Dorsal don't, ventral does, and then it will decussate again in the brainstem. All fibers end in the ipsilateral cerebellum, hence the name of the tract, and the major function of is the transmission of the proprioception or the unconsciousness. So for example, muscle spindle proprioception comes here, first synapse, and then it goes up second order neuron, and the third order neuron is right up there. Now we're going to look at some of the motor neuron. So this one is basically the corticospinal tract, again high yield, and this is the motor pathway and transmits signals from the brain to the musculature. Functions control the voluntary movement and consist of two neuron system, as we have discussed before, upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron, as it's the case for any motor pathway coming from the brain to the rest of the body, to the periphery. So these are descending motor tracts, and they are present in the anterior medial portion of the spinal cord, and previously they were known as the pyramidal tracts. It has a lateral and ventral anterior components. Ventral or anterior, it's basically the same thing. Dorsal posterior, ventral anterior. Pathway. So upper motor neurons leave the primary motor cortex. It will descend ipsilaterally, same side, through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, pass through the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. So its pathway is cerebral cortex coming down ipsilaterally, primary motor content descending right here through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. We have discussed the internal capsule in the previous lecture, so please review those if you haven't done so. Pass through the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain, and then it will decussate at this point. So at this point the decussation will occur. 90% of the lateral cerebrospinal tract decussate in the caudal medulla here and descends contralaterally. So decussation occur, pass through the midline, descend further contralaterally. So the rest of the 10% or ventral or anterior CST or cerebrospinal tract will decussate just before exiting the spinal cord. So 90% are going to decussate at this point, 10% are going to continue down, and then it will cross the line, decussate, and exit the spinal cord. So let's look at some, understand it through some of the diagrams right here. So the first synapse occur at the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So you see this is the upper motor neuron that starting from here, it's passing through the internal capsule, through the midbrain pons, all the way down. Now that's where the decussation is occurring. 90% go through here, 10% goes through there. Decussation like this, the other one comes like this, and then it will descend contralaterally, make another synapse and exit. Then the lower motor neuron will leave the spinal cord and innervate the skeletal muscle. The second synapse occurs at the neuromuscular junction. That's where the second synapse will occur. So remember this high yield point. Lateral cerebrospinal tract control limb musculature, while the ventral or anterior cerebrospinal tract controls the axial movement of the contralateral side. Contralateral, the other side. Right side of the brain control the left side of the body, or vice versa. Left side of the brain control the right side of the body. So that's how you will remember. Again, corticospinal tract, starting from the motor cortex, coming down through the internal capsule, ipsilaterally coming down into the spinal cord. 90% will decussate, go the other side, and then will exit the spinal cord, make a spinal nerve, come down, neuromuscular junction, that's where the second synapse will occur. 10% keep coming down ipsilaterally and will make the first synapse, decussate right before exiting the spinal cord, make a synapse and leave the spinal cord. Then we have the last slide here. it is the extrapyramidal tract, and there are three types of extrapyramidal tract. Number one is the reticulospinal tract. It involves in the controlling of the limb musculature, which is related to posture, balance, and pain signaling. The second one is the vestibulospinal tract. It is involved in receiving the impulses to maintain the balance and posture. The impulses are based on input received from the inner ear. The names are suggestive of that. And the last one is the tectospinal tract, is the involvement in the reflex movement of the head. Reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, and tectospinal. With this slide, we're going to end our discussion here. Thank you so much for joining in. And in the next slide, we're going to discuss further of the different part of the neuroanatomy. And my effort here is, or my struggle here is, that I'm going to discuss further so we can move on to histology, pathology, and onwards in the neurology, so you can understand it better and better prepare for the USMLE steps. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video.